Hello, everyone. My name is Simonetta Manfredi, and I'm a Professor of Equality and Diversity Management at Oxford Brookes University and Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange in the Business School. And I'm leading this project on women's spin-out. Welcome to this session. What we are doing, we will be presenting the findings from our latest report. But let me say to begin with that spin-out companies have now become center stage in a sense. The pandemic has brought to all of us the importance that we're all dependent on research in order to get out of this dreadful pandemic. And the commercialization of research is really important. So how those products and new technology can actually be translated into something that people can benefit from. So the spin-out is a way of commercializing research. So I believe that they will become more and more important, especially in the post-COVID recovery. However, women are significantly underrepresented in the spin-out leadership as founders and co-founders. So this is something that my colleague and I, a couple of years ago, we identified this gap in women's leadership of spin-out companies. And we wanted to understand why is it and what is happening. And as spin-out are becoming more prominent, also because the UK has introduced a knowledge exchange framework, it's really important to make sure that we take action to develop a much more gender inclusive ecosystem. So today we will be presenting the results from the findings from our latest research report on this subject. And then we will be joined by, where we're supposed to be 3 panelists, but now we've got 2, but there are 2 great panelists. And I welcome Dr. Olivia Champion, who is the founder and CEO of Biosystem Technology, a company that spun from the University of Exeter. Then I welcome Tamsin Mann, who is the Director of Policy and Communication at Praxis Oral, the UK Professional Association for Knowledge Exchange Practitioners. Then the 3rd panelist was supposed to be our Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and International Partnerships, Professor Linda King, who is co-founder and Director of Oxford Expression Technology. But unfortunately, she cannot join us because she's a virologist by background, and she's tied up with the preparations for the asymptomatic testing. So for those of you who are not familiar with our project, let me tell you a little bit about our project. So this project is funded by the EPSRC under its Inclusion Matters program. And it does focus on trying to understand the causes of women underrepresentation as founders or co-founders of spin-out companies. If I could have the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, I'll just carry on.
Bear with me. I'll see if I can get it to.
Yeah, to get to this next slide. And but is also very much focused on actions and trying to develop some interventions. So it's articulated in 3 stages. The first stage is doing research. We try, first of all, we're trying to understand what is the level of participation of women as founder, as founder of co-founders of spin-out companies. And I think it's fair to say that we probably, my colleagues, produced the very first report that provided a comprehensive picture because there is no data at the moment to evaluate this. The ESA data doesn't provide, is not disaggregate by sex. So the only way to find out was for us to work with the data set by Brookes, the company that has all data relating to not just spin-outs, but also to other companies. And also, as well as seeing where looking at the women's representation as founders and co-founders, which is quite low, is only 13%. That report was very comprehensive also in looking at the spin-out activities, identifying universities where there is much more intense spin-out activities, and also identifying the level of funding that women receive, and other things. All this report is on our website, and it's a really interesting one if you want to see it. What we are presenting today is a qualitative research, because we looked at the numbers, but it's important to establish what is behind those numbers. So the qualitative research that is based on a number of interviews is trying to understand compare the story of men and women who have successfully spun out. The other aspect of our project is about raising awareness, identifying women's role model, and develop mentoring opportunities and other initiatives. At the moment, we're also now focusing on using the research to inform the development of tools that university institutions can actually use to develop a much more inclusive ecosystem. I'll stop it there, and now I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Heather Griffith, who is the leading author of the latest report research. And over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Simonetta. Just to check everyone can hear me and see the screens as expected. It's not doing what I expected at this end, but hopefully it's all going so you can see. So as Simonetta introduced, there were 3 parts to the study. Some of you may be aware of the previous report that was more of a quantitative in nature and mapped the landscapes of spin-outs in the UK. The second report is the qualitative report, where we interviewed spin-out founders. And the aims of this study was to try and get behind some of the figures from the first, so to better understand the spin-out journey. And for us to map the pathways to spin out as well, because it was quite an unexplored area, really. There was some things a little bit about the process, but not really so much of in depth of what it means step by step to spin out, and who was doing it and how they were doing it. So that was what we were trying to uncover here. Secondly, we wanted to bring this gender element in it and to understand if there's any additional challenges for women as spin out founders. And I'll address a couple of those at the end of my presentation. And as Simonetta alluded to, one of the overall aims of this study is to use this empirical research to inform the way institutions address really and embed entrepreneurship and academic entrepreneurship into their policies and practices. And so we wanted to try and make sure that these are inclusive from the beginning. So overall, we interviewed 35 spin-out founders. They'd spun out from institutions across the UK. It was important to us to include women and men to try and get a real comparison of what they've been doing. And if there were really that would highlight any gender differences. We spoke to 20 women and 15 men. We also interviewed 8 key informants, that we called them. These were predominantly just to try and get a bit of a broader picture, a richer flavour of what was happening on this spin-out journey. And that included mostly people from technology transfer offices at institutions, but also we had some people from knowledge exchange more broadly in commercial law. Of the founders in the sample, 77% originated from Russell Group universities. This makes this sample fairly representative. In our previous report, we identified that 70% of spin-outs come from, or research emerges from Russell Group institutions. So this isn't perhaps unsurprising that this was the sample. And as happens with quite a lot of qualitative research of this kind, some of our most interesting findings came from the sample itself. So only 31%, so less than a third of the interviewees we spoke to were senior academics when they spun out their research. So this kind of was starting to challenge the myth that it's only professors that do spin-outs. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, men were overrepresented as senior researchers here, because 7 of the men interviewed, so more than half, were professors or senior academics at their time of spinning out. compared to just 4 of the women. The women were more likely to be early career researchers, because almost 50% of them were early career researchers when they spun out, compared to 20% of men. So the findings, if anyone's read the report already, you'll see there's an awful lot of really interesting stuff in there. So we have to try and narrow this down for the presentation. So we've just focused on a handful of the findings and some of the key themes really that have come out and that are those most interesting. In the interviews, we made sure we asked founders about their motivations for spinning out and focused a lot on the challenges that they faced. The final 2 themes that we're going to speak about are the ones that are more gendered in nature. So we'll see how some of those different challenges between women and men have played out. So one of the ubiquitously really across the board, the motivation for these spin-out founders was that they wanted to see their research make a difference in the world. A lot of them referred to this idea of having application in the real world, or real world impact was some of the terminology they used. Because I think for many people, they weren't really feeling that their research in the realms of the university was really doing that. As this quote at the bottom says, you can only do so much research for research's sake. What's just pertinent to remember here is that we are asking founders to reflect upon their motivations. So they were looking back in time, trying to recall what their motivations were. And the reason that I mention that is because when the next piece of research we've done with early career researchers, this didn't really apply as a motivation. They weren't really seeing this kind of real world application right back at the beginning. But it was something that the spin-out founders drew upon quite regularly, I think, to help them get through their challenges. And it was one of the things that kept them going with their spin-out, particularly when things got difficult. Another area that was really got a lot in slightly different formations was the idea that running a spin-out company was giving these academics more freedom and flexibility that they weren't really getting in their academic work. And we're all social scientists, so this was quite interesting for us to kind of unpick and understand. That obviously the founders we were speaking to come from STEM backgrounds. They'll be working a lot in labs, as well as teaching in labs and in classrooms and all the administration that comes along with that. So their schedules were a lot more rigid than some of us in social sciences are used to. So with running a business, they felt this gave them a bit more autonomy over their time, kind of when they worked, where they worked, and particularly how they worked. It was very different in some ways to a lot of what they've been doing. The most common reason cited amongst women in the sample for the freedom and flexibility was actually because it allowed them to manage their childcare. Now, I think that sounds like a little bit of a kind of a common thing. Oh yes, women want flexible working, work-life balance for childcare. But if we think back to the sample, who was in this sample, there was a lot of women who were earlier on in their career, putting them at that life stage where this was an issue for them. So it did come up several times with women with younger children predominantly, that this idea of running a business just gave them more autonomy and this freedom and flexibility. And they were challenging the way they worked as well. They were challenging the idea of having to work in a particular way or at a certain time. But it wasn't just women who appreciated this. All sorts of people at different stages of their life liked the idea that they had a different relationship to time and work doing their own company. As this self-described millennial writes in the second quote, he said, "I don't like the 9-to-5 environment." He said he wasn't very motivated by it, and actually he liked the flexibility to travel or go traveling on a Friday and make up some time at the weekend if he liked. It was just, he said, that was important to him. So it's important to recognize that the different people want flexibility for different reasons, and that it's actually valuable to a lot of academics, not just those with children, but it would certainly be a benefit, to have more time flexibility for those with children. it's an idea of these people kind of recognizing a different career pathway or an opportunity that wasn't open to them when they started their academic careers, perhaps. Another finding, I've called these shared challenges because this slide and the next are going to look at some of the challenges that women and men both spoke about quite a lot. In the literature, there's not a huge amount of literature in this area in any way, but more widely it's assumed that women perhaps lack business experience in this case, and that's a bit of a gendered issue. Whereas in our research replicates a kind of growing amount of research that says this actually isn't the case at all. Everybody found a lack of business experience at the beginning a real challenge. As one woman founder described it, it was a bit like doing things in the dark. And this isn't to say founders didn't have support. They had a great amount of support from their universities on the whole, technology transfer offices. They were pointed in the directions of who to speak to and where to get help. But they didn't know it. They still had to learn the very basics of making a business plan, all the kind of nuts and bolts of starting a business. There was a sense, though, that this experience or inexperience was felt more acutely for those earlier on in their careers. As this second quote alludes to, that somebody who had just come out of their PhD, it was quite unusual at that time for early career academics to be doing spin-outs and starting their own business. But one of the reasons this could be is because more senior academics felt that they had transferable skills that starting up a business. A few more senior research likened it to running a research group, that a lot of the challenges were the same. And as this woman founder at the end, final quote here says that people underestimate or perhaps don't recognize the transferable skills that the academics have into a business setting. So running a research group is managing staff, it is thinking about budgets, it is thinking about where the next source of money is going to come from. So perhaps there's something that senior academics have a little bit of advantage there because they have had that experience, albeit in a different form. Another shared challenge that's probably not just for spin-out founders, and it's probably something a lot of us can relate to. It's finding the time to actually do the work required to start a business. So although starting a business gave founders greater flexibility in a lot of cases, it just gave them an incredible amount of extra work. They were working long hours, and at the beginning especially, a lot of founders were still doing their academic day jobs, and the spin-out became a bit of an extracurricular activity bolted on the side. And as it grew, therefore the time they had to try and find for it grew in time. As one founder put it, if you're going to retain your academic role, you have to accept that you're not going to have the work-life balance you might want. He said that was more, even more so at the beginning, because there's a lot of work goes into getting these off the ground. A few founders did describe how they'd negotiated time with their managers and with their colleagues, some of them quite successfully, but it really depended on not just the institution's attitude to kind of academic entrepreneurship and commercialization, but also the attitude of the department, research leads, your head of departments, whoever you were working with, as to how well received it was that people were doing commercialization as well as their research. So on the whole, people were, as this second quote illustrates, having to squeeze it in where you can. This predominantly meant snippets of time during the day, but evenings, weekends. As one, I think it was an older academic founder put it, he said it was a hobby, but it became an obsession. He just found it was sort of what he spent all his free time doing. I'm linking back to kind of some of the previous things you said about flexibility and childcare can be a bit problematic. Founders did say that the reason they were doing this was because there was no formally allocated time. in their workload to do anything like this. Their commercialization activities weren't recognized as warranting academic time or to take time away from any of their other roles. This may be changing, but at the time, there's a few founders who said they weren't necessarily feeling that their spin-out was a legitimate type of research. As this last quote quite wonderfully puts it, that it was thought of being a little bit grubby and not quite academic enough, not what we do as researchers. But this founder went on to say that since the introduction of the knowledge exchange framework, things were starting to turn a little bit in her favor. And she says, I quote, "She is now completely on vogue." The next couple of slides are going to be just more about the gendered findings. But I have to say investment was, and funding more widely, was a challenge for everybody. But what was quite notable about the investment is that it was dominated by men. It was notably dominated by men. Women and men founders commented on this. And these women were quite used to being in the minority, yet still they noticed that there was very, very few women in the investment spaces. And the first quote just sums it up really. "It's predominantly men pitching to men." Interestingly, several women founders explained ways in which they turned this to their advantage, kind of using the novelty factor of being a woman to make themselves memorable, particularly when in some STEM subjects, the default, as this second quote says, is that you expect a man to be coming out. The second quote was interesting because this woman said that my name doesn't give away if I'm a man or a woman. So they expect a woman to come out talking about oil and gas. And then she uses the element of surprise to make herself memorable to the investors. So it is not unsurprising that there's so few women in the investment spaces and within the community. As we've already said, a little bit in this discussion, but also previously, that women are a minority in STEM, we know this, and women are also a minority in this business world. So in the investment community, they're looking for kind of experts in both. All founders and the key informants, people we spoke to, were acknowledging that things were changing, that they were seeing more women in investment, both as investors and as mentors and coming into the room, but that progress was slow, really. And as this final quote says here, with so few people, you're not always going to be harder to find what you need. So she said, I don't think I've ever spoken to a female investor who was also technical, as in also needed the technical knowledge required for her business. The final theme that I'm just going to bring up here is the idea of stereotypes, the gender stereotypes. Fortunately, this wasn't not a widespread phenomena in the research. There was only a handful of examples. But it was quite remarkable that these examples were there and exactly what they were and who they were affecting. Just to note that this doesn't mean other people weren't experiencing it, but there's a tendency, and other gender scholars will recognize this, that when you particularly go and ask women, do you experience gender bias? They won't necessarily recognize that they do, particularly those in minority spaces. But we've got these examples here showing that it's still happening. The first one is quite a nice example because it's somebody whose research and spin-out work was going to be profiled on their university's web pages as a good practice. Somebody doing something a woman being very successful in both STEM and business. But when the photographer came in to take pictures for the website, he kind of wanted to de-glamorize her a bit. He said, could you put the goggles on, tie up your hair, put on a jumper, and wipe off your lipstick? The same founder also had a story of how she was kind of racially profiled as well within the stereotype of a woman. So kind of her gender and ethnicity did intersect to become as another stereotype. So she was very aware of that. And she said in her words that it was hilarious the way she was being portrayed, but also she said it was a shame because she said, a quote, it's making her look nerdy and uncool, which is not what she wanted to see scientists, particularly for other women and young girls. So the second example was how women are being perceived in business. And this was a story of a meeting of research fellows who were all on quite a prestigious fellowship scheme within STEM. And the founder explained how they took a straw poll. There was 15 people in the room, 5 of whom were women. And somebody asked, who's been accused of sleeping with somebody to get to your position of CEO? And all 5 of the women put their hands up. This is bearing in mind they are STEM researchers who have got these prestigious fellowships and started their own businesses, hence why they are CEOs, but the stereotypes are persistent. And the reason these stereotypes are an issue is because they're delegitimizing the knowledge, the experience, and the success of these women. It's creating an additional challenge for women in their journeys. And although one instance of stereotyping isn't necessarily a big challenge to overcome, it's the fact that this could be happening persistently, regularly, just these small comments and instances, creating more of an accumulated disadvantage for women that builds up over time. So just to summarize, we wanted to, again, we want to do a really big overview of the findings. So it's similar with the recommendations. We've tried to make a few recommendations based on these findings. So just give a bit of a flavour of those. One of the ways to stop several of these things, like stop women being in the minority or just try to increase the visibility of women, perhaps, is just to have them as role models and mentors, have them more present. That could be virtually, online, but it could also be when we get back to doing networking events and training events, just to have women's presence there, trying to share and showcase the work that women founders are doing. We'd also like to encourage technology transfer officers and anybody else really who's involved in the kind of spin-out ecosystem at institutions and beyond to actively foster more diverse networks of expertise. Now, we, doing this project, recognise that it's a real challenge because when you're trying to find people who are a minority to be at your events, that there's few people to choose from, and you're regularly asking the same people to do all this extra work. But we hope that this will grow. It's an initial investment in time and energy, but it will grow into something where gradually the presence of women will just increase and this won't become such an issue. Another suggestion is to set up specific funding opportunities for women and underrepresented minorities. People doing work looking at entrepreneurship and EDI recognise that women and other minorities, they're getting less funding. And it's not totally understood as to why, but by providing specific funding opportunities for there, it just increases the opportunities for women and minorities and makes it more accessible for everybody to find that money. Because as you've seen, getting money is a challenge, but in our previous report, we also showed that women are getting less money as well. We'd like to encourage institutions to develop academic entrepreneurship programs that are gender sensitive and recognise intersecting inequalities. With the introduction of the knowledge exchange framework and a shift of lots of institutions towards enterprise, that there are going to be more training programs happening. So we'd like to see that gender sensitivity, which is really just recognising that there is a gendered issue, recognising that the ecosystem is dominated by white men, really, and to also to see how that is impacting people. And we'll make various more specific recommendations about what that means, but it's maybe just going in with it to an awareness that it isn't a level playing field. We'd like to see policies and practices developed that allow researchers to balance an academic career with commercialization of research. This is about the idea of finding time, recognizing commercialization as a more legitimate activity, bringing it into workload planning. It may link to the previous suggestion of funding opportunities. Academics can have time bought out of teaching and other responsibilities so that they're not having to rely on evening, weekends, family and childcare support to get this work done. It needs to be more incorporated within the academic work we currently do. And finally, just to kind of sum up and relate that point, that academic entrepreneurships and the development of spin-out companies and similar, it should be more properly recognised and rewarded in the academic promotion process. An issue that's come up in this research and the next piece of research is that whilst you are developing a spin-out company, you're not able to publish at the same rate. You're not able to explore other research opportunities, partly because of time, but also because of the, as one founder described it, catch-22 of patenting, whereby you can't publish on something that's awaiting a patent and when something's patented, so that it's harder for academics to carry on with their traditional career whilst doing this commercialization. So that was a real quick run overview of everything we've been doing. I'm just going to leave on this page just for a moment our contact details, because we're still looking to build up a real network of people that want to get involved in the topic. We're trying to be quite active on Twitter and social media, just to try and build the network and disseminate some of these findings. And if you think anything's going to be of use to you, please get in touch and we can talk about how it can be worthwhile, or if you want to get involved a bit further. I'm going to hand over to Simonetta just to introduce our panel speakers and to kick off the Q&A and discussion.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was great. At this point, we will probably applaud, but we are all online. I'm going to turn now to our panelists, our guest. Our audience, who unfortunately I'm not able to see, but I know there are quite a lot of you on this webinar. If you wish, what I will do, I will ask the panelists for their response to the findings, their comments, but please do use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions, or you can use the chat. There are colleagues who will be collecting your questions, so there will be an opportunity for our audience to put your questions to the panelists and indeed to Heather as well. So if I start with Olivia to begin with, can I ask you to comment on what is your response to these findings? What is your initial reaction?
Yeah, well, I just found that so, I mean, it encapsulated my experience in starting biosystems technology completely. It was really interesting, you know, hearing the story of all these other founders, and it really reflects my own experience. So, you know, in terms of motivation, I have 3 children, and the youngest is still at primary school. And when I started biosystems technology, I was still on maternity leave with my 3rd child. And at the time, I think one of the main motivations for starting the company was around having greater flexibility and not being kind of tied to the lab and the kind of the routine that I had that just didn't really fit with having a family. But now, as you say, when I reflect on you know what kind of keeps me going, keeps me motivated, it is very much this kind of real world impact and being able to see that I'm making a difference. So that really resonated with me. And the shared challenges, yes, absolutely. It was, you know, a lack of business experience. I was coming from an academic background. I didn't really have access to other advisors or people who I could really talk to about, you know, this journey. And that was a real challenge for me, trying to do this. Everything was just kind of just stumbling my way forward and trying to figure out how to do it. And I think there are programs now where people can, this issue between the tension between focusing on your academic career and trying to, you know, do your work that's going to generate publications or grant applications. You know, you're either working on that or you're focusing on your, you know, understanding what kind of business opportunity you might have and trying to start the Spinout. And so it's quite a gamble at the start, and there isn't much time to do that. But there are some programs now, and I attended one of those programs called, it was the iCure program, which buys out 3 months of your time. And that was really valuable for me, because it gave me this opportunity, this 3 month space where I wasn't expected to work on, you know, my research that I was doing in the lab. I had the time to explore this. So I think having that time and that opportunity to really think about, you know, and understand what kind of a business opportunity you have and what your business model might look like is really valuable. In terms of whether starting a spin-out company is kind of legitimate, and if there's some sort of snootiness around that, I think historically there has been, and I think people have really kind of looked down a little bit on people who are in business, but I don't think that's really the case so much now, especially since impact has been one of the metrics that is scored in the ref for the universities. So one of the ways that universities can demonstrate impact is through the creation of spin-out companies that have this real world impact. And so I think that, you know, entrepreneurs who are trying to commercialize their research have a lot more support from universities, and it's more encouraged because of the fact that the universities can use this to their advantage in the ref. And certainly in the 2021 ref, Exeter University have used biosystems technology as one of their impact case studies. So I think that, you know, but and also there's a lot more encouragement for academics to partner with industry for, you know, for different grant funding or PhD studentships. So I think there is a bit more kind of collaboration and partnership there. And the stereotypes section that you talked about, you know, I found that really interesting, because I had to pitch for investment to get biosystems technology started. And, you know, it was just a sea of about 200, predominantly men. I mean, there were some women in the audience, but mainly they were then more on kind of administrative sort of roles. And I think that I may have been the only woman pitching. There might have been one other. I certainly don't remember seeing many women. And it's a strange sort of feeling to just always be that kind of that lone woman in the room. And you know, when I think back on my experience, you know, early on when I was going to do that pitch, I had somebody who was meant to be, you know, kind of like advising me and kind of in quite a senior role, who sort of jokingly, but sort of said to me, why don't you wear your tartiest dress to go and do the pitch? You know, and it's just all those little things that kind of undermine, you know, and also many times I've had people say to me that, you know, I'm only there as the kind of the representative of the woman. So it undermines the fact that you're there because you're doing a good job and that you've started a business and you've, you know, developed the IP. You know, it kind of takes away from that, even the suggestion that you're there because you're just the token female to, you know, for the ticking the box of being politically correct. So yeah, for me, it's just really interesting work, and I think that I'm really interested to sort of see how this work develops. I like the recommendations that you've made, and I've got some you know, some ideas about that as well, about ways in which we can support the female entrepreneurs in the universities.
Thank you very much, Olivia. That is quite reassuring to hear, in a sense that, you know, the findings just resonate with your experience, but at the same time, you know, some of the most, it's a bit depressing to hear about the, you know, the kind of gender bias that women are still encountering. And we probably all experience that at different stages. Tamsin, what is your response to these findings?
Thanks, Simonetta, and thank you, Heather. Yeah, I think, I mean, from speaking from Praxis Oral's point of view, I think this report we've welcomed this for a variety of reasons. Firstly, because of course it does address, you know, the issues of diversity in spin-outs, and spin-outs, as you said, Simonetta, are such a kind of touch paper when it comes to talking about knowledge exchange at the moment. There's such an intense focus on spin-outs and has been even more so during this year. So, you know, we've always known the importance of diversity in spin-outs, and that diversity cuts many ways. It's diversity of you know, the spin-out founders, it's diversity of the subject areas that spin-outs come from. and its diversity of mission group. I mean, your report, Drew, obviously, the most of your examples come from Russell Group universities because that's where most spin-outs come from, but we do need to extend, we need more spin-outs from more different types of universities. We can't maintain this very top-heavy picture if we're going to have more spin-outs. So diversity is so important to the whole spin-out ecosystem in many different ways. And I think by focusing on one type of diversity issue, you have revealed problems with the ecosystem that apply to everybody. And I think that's really important for this report. And what certainly I found very, very interesting. And it confirmed some of the things I knew, or some of the things I'd suspected, some of the things I'd come across when I worked in university knowledge exchange. And some things that surprised me. I was very surprised that people did spin-outs because it gave them more flexibility with their working life. And I'm so impressed that people like Olivia are setting up companies when they have small children. Having being a working mother myself, I find that amazing. But so that's surprising. But I think for me, what was very valuable was the spin-out journeys that you described, and the different types of spin-out journeys, because there are lots of assumptions made about how spin-outs are created. And those assumptions probably go hand in hand with the type of, the stereotypes of people who are spin-out founders. So just revealing those different types of journeys, the career point at which you decide you're going to go for a spin-out, that it's not just, your stereotypical white male professorial academic. That's very important. But the different routes you can have along the spin-out journey, whether you do it full-time or part-time, and how you get funding, how you approach funding, the kind of team that you build, or the kind of team that you're drawn into. I think we need to tell more stories about those spin-out journeys as part of our raising awareness about diversity. I think the points that relate to the wider research culture are very important. So the points about workload, points about the legitimacy of this activity for all kinds of knowledge exchange, but specifically for commercialization, which is much more time consuming than other forms of knowledge exchange. I've long been a champion of fellowship type awards for just buying out people's time, because time is regularly cited as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, barrier to knowledge exchange in kind of academic side surveys. And I just think you have to recognise that, and the way you can overcome that is by buying out people's time. And we don't see so much of that for commercialization specifically. I've seen a few programs for knowledge exchange more generally, but that tends to be for exploring different models of knowledge exchange rather than commercialization specifically. And of course, the iCure program is one of the programs that does offer that time, and I think that's a program that has been expanded in recent years. It seems to be so successful, but I can't see why it isn't rolled out so that any university that wants to make use of that model can do so. But I think there's good points. We need to address research culture, diversity and equality there. And of course, the points you made that go right back to how we recruit more girls and women into STEM careers in the first place, and retain those people in academia, so that going into academia is a proactive choice, and it's something they can think about doing. For the tech transfer offices specifically, the phrase that sticks with me from Jackie Barnett at Bristol, who I think you interviewed for this project, was, we need to be the change we want to see. So we do need to make sure that we are, recruiting into tech transfer careers, the kind of people that academic founders feel they can have a conversation with. TTOs are often the first step on a journey, and so that first step needs to be a really positive first step. And that goes to the first person you might go and talk to about potential disclosure of your invention. But later on, it's about the kind of the support you get for pursuing that idea, that invention, and then the people that are brought in as your mentors, your role models, the people who you as Olivia has said, that you meet who are potential founders and funders along the way, and then the kind of staff, the team you get involved, the directors and the C-suite, these things all matter in this picture of diversity. And that's something that I think as a TTO community, we need to be more proactive about, rather than just letting it happen in the course of time, which I think it will, because if we look at the student enterprise environment, I think there's a lot of diversity there and a lot of initiatives trying to recruit more women into venture capital. For example, there's a project which I've mentioned previously when I've been discussing with the London Business School to try and get more gender and ethnic diversity into VC. But we need to be more proactive and more aware of what we're doing to be really, really helpful and supportive in that respect. So I think this report, we will certainly think about how we can do more to support the recommendations and hopefully work with you, on an ongoing basis to make some of the recommendations actually happen and make a difference.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. And yes, very important points. The IQR, we found other founders really benefited. It seems to be really important, is giving people that time. And indeed, there is a lot that your community, as you say, can do, perhaps to really support and help in getting more women into the commercialization arena. I think we want to turn to our audience and give them an opportunity to ask their questions to our panelists, also to others. So one of our colleagues has been monitoring the questions. Becca, are you telling us what the questions are?
Yeah, so there's quite a few questions. I'll just go from the first one. So I'm on the other side, being a co-founder of a spin-out. Any suggestion on how people like me can help lowering gender barriers?
Okay, thank you. Any comments from who wants to? Olivia, do you want to?
So the question is, as a co-founder, so is this a male co-founder, what they can do to reduce gender barriers? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's what I can see from this, yeah.
Okay. So I have a male co-founder for Biosystems Technology. And I think that, the co-founder relationship is really important, that you have, this kind of mutual trust and respect, and that you can work, I think that relationship is really key to a successful business. And I think so how we've worked together is, very much, I'm CEO of the company and I kind of make the decisions, I drive things forward. But we have these sort of discussions, and and when I need support in certain areas, then that he's always been very supportive. At times, when I've had things going on in the family where it's been very pressured, or if there's different events that happen, if a child's sick or something, then I know that there's that kind of support that's there. So I think, it's very difficult to kind of pin it down into what that support actually means. But I think being supportive, I think providing an opportunity to talk through ideas in a kind of a safe environment where you can just talk things through and thrash out kind of your strategy for the business. And I think that's really important. And in terms of encouraging other females who might want to start a business and commercialize their research, I think that a lot of it can come down to confidence and opportunity, and also understanding the process. So I guess it's a case of maybe in lab meetings, if you run a lab and you have people in that lab who are have that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, or that kind of interest, to just provide opportunities to encourage that and to talk about it where they feel confident to talk about it, not kind of embarrassed. So I don't know if that's really answering the question, but yeah, they're my thoughts on that question.
Tamsin, do you have any thoughts from the knowledge exchange community perspective?
I suppose it's just being about stepping up and I suppose talking about it, bringing those issues to the fore, not just being aware and hoping that something will happen. It is about vocalizing, either your willingness to have women on your team and demonstrating that by recruiting women onto your team, or if you are a women founder, then just having a higher profile. Because I don't know whether you found this, that in your research, that whether women who were founders, I suppose, I don't know, because as a spin-out founder, you need profile because you want to attract funding, you need to attract attention, don't you? But whether you found that women founders were slightly less likely to just put themselves forward for opportunities to be on panels, to be the center of attention as founders. I don't know, but I think that's possibly just having a higher profile, I think, is helpful. So you become that role model, you become one of somebody that you're setting that example.
Thank you. Becca, can we have another couple of questions, please?
Yes, of course. There's quite a few questions coming up around this topic. So stemming from your research, what are your early thoughts? Oh, sorry, it's just moved. What are your early thoughts about what gender-sensitive program of support would look like?
I think perhaps I can take that one. And we are in the process of developing interventions. So we are actually using the findings from the research to see how they can inform intervention. But we don't want to reinvent the wheel, because there is a lot of work that has already been done. So we are reviewing what is existing already out there and what can be used for this particular context. Really also consulting widely on this. And I've seen a few things on the chat. There might be other colleagues who might wish to join that process of consultation. The more feedback we have, the better. The next question, Becca, please.
Yeah, so this next one is, I work in a similar space in the US, curious about whether the UK government provides specific support or programs to support academic commercialization, or is it primarily up to individual universities?
Tamsin, you're probably quite well informed about programs. I would say yes, there are programs like Innovate UK.
Yeah, so I think iCure is the main one. There were a few questions actually relating to the situation in the States, and I do think this is an area where Praxis Oral could work with our sister organisation, Autumn, in the US, because Autumn is Praxis Oral's equivalent, and they have special interest groups for equality and diversity, but also women inventors. So they've been addressing this issue for quite some time. And in fact, there was a very interesting interview with a female TTO director in the States a couple of months ago by Global University Venturing, Nicole Mercier, and she was highlighting the concern she had about the impact of COVID-19 on female inventors because of the issues of traditional roles being taken on again during the pandemic, and just not seeing the same, just seeing a decline in the rate of disclosures from women, or more disclosures from men who were at home having more time because they weren't in the labs, perhaps. So some interesting reflections on what she was seeing at Washington State University, I think it was. So that was interesting, and I know there's lots of, we don't feel like the TTO community is not gender diverse. Lots of our directors are women. Lots of the the leaders in terms of university research commercialization are women, in both the US and the UK. And yet that doesn't seem, we don't, it's so in some respects, there are findings on that you're seeing are slightly surprising, but at this, we realize that we need to pay attention to that. So I would like a more conversation between the US and the UK on that, rather than focusing on what we traditionally talk about, was just the rate of spin-outs and how many spin-outs MIT might have compared to Cambridge. I think we could do much more if we talked about diversity rather than just numbers.
Thank you. Olivia, is anything you want to add to this question?
Yeah, I think
I think that the main sort of funding that I'm aware of, the kind of the government funding, is through Innovate UK, which is, you know, Innovate UK and HEFCE funded ICURE programme. And that's limited to only a certain number of universities, but it has been really successful. I think there are different accelerator and incubator programmes, but they're not as kind of, I don't, from my understanding and kind of looking at the different programmes that are available, they're much more kind of developed in the US. And I know that, you know, I've met some people, you know, founders who've been on some of those accelerator programs, and they've been really successful. Yeah, so I think that those kind of programs, that training and that skilling up of people, especially if you're making that transition from university into business, I think that's really important. I don't think there's enough of it at the moment. So I think that, you know, people are just kind of left to kind of just drive forward themselves rather than be kind of picked up into, you know, and trained up and skilled up, which is what you need early on, I think, to give you the best chance of success.
Can we have another question, Becca, please? I think it's going to be probably the last, because then I want to briefly ask our panelists for some final thoughts.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so this one is, I'd be interested to know if there were any insights from the research into the role of accelerators and other commercialization programs, particularly if these were helpful or inclusive environments for women, or if they perpetuated the same issues as the wider environment.
I probably can answer that. I don't think we looked into that. Heather, is that fair to say we didn't look into that into great details? The role of accelerator did come up, but we didn't really, we didn't investigate that into any depth. I don't know, Heather, is anything else you want to add there?
The only thing, yeah, that's it in summary, that we didn't look at accelerators. That would be an interesting separate area, I think, to look at that. But we did have a couple of insights from incubators, and it was a very mixed response. I think some people really found the incubators just the most supportive, wonderful places, whereas there was also a couple of comments that they felt they were quite exclusive as well. So I think it, again, just depended on who you were, where you were, and the circumstances, which is kind of a summary of the whole research, really. It was just, yeah, very individual, very different across the board.
That's perhaps possibly a future piece of research. I think I'm conscious of time, and I really would like to conclude with, we have collected all the chats, all the questions, so we might be able to get back to people who perhaps didn't, whose questions were not read out. But I really would like to conclude with our panelists and ask them some very final thoughts. Can you tell me one or two actions that you think we could do now? Let's start with Olivia.
Okay, so I think that funding for business skilling programs that build these kind of female business ecosystems is really important. And I think that should include all these different areas, things like understanding about releasing your IP too soon, because if you're coming from academia, you know, your aim is to publish and to get grant funding, and as soon as you've released that, you know, that that information into the, even in an abstract book, you know, you can no longer patent. Also training, you know, within those programs, things like leadership training, and all the way through to board level, so that so people are kind of prepared and they start to get those skills, and they can look to their mentors and role models and learn from them. So I think that's really important, like the skilling up of people, and that could include, you know, may well look like an accelerator, you know. And I, from my experience of accelerators, and I've sort of travelled around and looked at and met people from Techstars and Y Incubator, I think they're called, and I think they are predominantly male, just because that's the nature of the beast. You know, it's mainly men who are in this sort of this sector. So I think maybe, you know, that kind of an accelerator that focuses on all of those things and is a kind of a defined program would be really beneficial. I would certainly love to do one of those even now. And the second thing, I think, better access to investment funding, and it keeps comes up over and over again. But I think, you know, my experience not even that long ago, and still now, I've actually started a second business, and that second business, you know, I'm in the process now of kind of building up the business case to go for investment, and so, you know, I'm kind of back in that scene again. And it's just mainly men. There are some of these kind of female focused angel investor programs, but they're quite small, they're quite few and far between, and some of them are quite niche. So I think access to investment is really key. You know, you're just not going to have a chance of a success, you know, starting and building and growing a business unless you can get that investment. So maybe the training around, you know, how to position yourself, how to pitch, and how to value your business, and kind of, you know, because also it's been shown that women, you know, ask for less money and get less money than men. So I think that women need a whole lot of training and support in that area. So they would be my sort of two main recommendations: skilling up and access to investment.
That's great. Very, very important recommendation. Tamsin?
Yeah, I would say on Olivia's point about education around IP, I think is incredibly important. And I know that the IPO is trying to get in more early in the academic career and do more education around IP. So we'll see what kind of impact that has generally. So I think in terms, so I will focus on the role of the TTO in particular, and I think it comes back to being proactive. So I think TTOs need to think about how they can be much more proactive in this space. I think it's a mixture of internal communication with departments and with heads of department, but also, you know, reaching across to equality and diversity teams where you know there are obviously institutional policies, but it needs to be more aware of the role of the TTO, and the TTO needs to, you know, inform them of what they need more. And that relates to, you know, we've talked about the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Concordat, which is coming on stream now. You know, that is all about leadership, and it's about institutional policies and processes. So commercialization needs to be part and parcel of that institutional attitude to equality and diversity. And then I would agree actually with, you know, specific programs for funding. I think that's where we traditionally see a gap. You know, we've called it the valley of death for any kind of spin out. But I think the specific issues that there are with, you know, female funders having less investment and getting less of the funding that they need, I think it seems like there is a specific gap there that Innovate UK could really step in and help to plug. So I would say that was a recommendation.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. Very concrete and I think, you know, doable recommendation, something that we can start work on. So I really like to thanks very much both of you for sharing your experience, your expertise, and responding to our findings, and also for your really good suggestions in terms of recommendations. Thank you very much to our audience for joining us today and all your really good, interesting comments. We will take them up. And last but not least, Heather, you've done a great presentation. And thank you very much to the whole team, because there is a whole team behind this research reports, for all your hard work, dedication, and indeed enthusiasm. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed this session. Thank you.